I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
The moment King Charles unfolded Elizabeth's hidden letter, the room changed forever. This was not a ceremonial note, not a private blessing, and not a mother's sentimental farewell. It was a direct royal instruction, written in the late Queen's own hand, naming Sophie as the true crown heir in spirit, trust, and duty, and leaving Charles visibly emotional as the monarchy's future suddenly felt rewritten. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles stood in the private chamber with the sealed page trembling between his fingers, while one senior aide waited near the door and understood that silence had become part of history. The king had received the letter from Elizabeth's personal archive, a protected collection of private papers, family instructions, and personal records kept away from ordinary palace routine. The second seal carried the warning that it could only be opened after a private family review, meaning this was never meant to be gossip, tribute, or comfort. It was meant to be a reckoning. Charles read the first line once. Then he read it again. His hand tightened around the page, as if the paper itself had become heavier than any crown, and then he slowly lowered himself into a chair without saying a word. The sentence was plain, devastating, and impossible to soften. Elizabeth's hidden letter identified Sophie as the true crown heir of royal service, moral authority, and family continuity, placing her above others in symbolic trust. Crown heir, in this meaning, did not mean someone replacing the legal line to the throne. It meant the person Elizabeth believed carried the spirit, judgment, and emotional discipline the monarchy needed to survive. Charles felt the blow as both sovereign and son. As the monarch, he had to protect the order of the crown. As Elizabeth's child, he had to face the possibility that his mother had seen something in the family that he had not wanted to admit. Sophie's name did not remove William's future, and it did not erase Camilla's place beside him. But it challenged something deeper. It asked who truly carried Elizabeth's legacy when titles, ceremonies, and public smiles were stripped away. The aide watched Charles place the letter on the table, then press 2 fingers against the edge, as though stopping it from changing the room any further. Yet the room had already changed. William would hear Sophie's name and weigh it against duty. Camila would hear it and feel the quiet sting of being measured against another woman's loyalty. Anne would hear it and understand that Elizabeth had left behind more than memory. She had left behind a judgment. But before the palace could understand what Elizabeth had done, everyone had to face the woman she had chosen, and the people wounded by that choice. Sophie had spent years standing near the edge of royal history, never demanding the center, never chasing the spotlight, never forcing herself into the line of power. Yet Elizabeth's hidden letter dragged her into the most dangerous position of all, not as a claimant to a throne, but as the person the late Queen trusted most to carry the soul of the crown. Sophie sat in a private room with Edward beside her, and for a long moment she could not speak. The trusted confidant had spent her royal life choosing duty over attention, listening more than she talked, serving more than she asked, and now those quiet years had returned as a burden no one could ignore. The crown, in this story, meant more than the throne itself. It meant the public duty, family discipline, and moral example that held the monarchy together when titles alone were not enough. Edward watched her face change from disbelief to fear, and he understood that Elizabeth's praise had placed his wife in the center of a storm. Charles felt that storm from the other side. The king knew the letter did not threaten William's legal future, but it did challenge the emotional order of the family. William remained the prince who would one day inherit the throne, yet even he had to face the fact that Elizabeth had separated bloodline from trust. Anne read the news with sharp control, because the Princess Royal understood what service looked like when it had no appetite for applause. Camilla, however, received Sophie's name like a quiet wound. The Queen Consort did not need anyone to explain the danger. Elizabeth had chosen another woman as the living keeper of her values, and that choice landed with the force of rejection. Sophie lowered her eyes when Edward repeated the line that had unsettled everyone. The truest heir is not always the nearest to the throne. He said it from the documented account of the private family review, and the words seemed to take the air from the room. The phrase did not crown Sophie in law, but it crowned her in meaning, and meaning could be more painful than protocol. She had never sought this recognition, yet refusing it would feel like turning away from Elizabeth's final trust. Charles knew that every person around him would hear the sentence differently. William would hear a warning about humility. Anne would hear a command to protect the Queen's judgment. Edward would hear the price his wife had to pay for loyalty. Camilla would hear humiliation, not tribute. And the wound became deeper when the family discovered the hidden incident that made Elizabeth write those words in the first place. The letter did not come from nowhere. It was born from one specific night, behind palace walls. A night when Elizabeth watched her family fracture over loyalty, pride, and inheritance. By dawn, something inside the monarch had hardened. She saw who argued, who retreated, who protected peace, and who quietly held the family together when everyone else failed. Elizabeth sat at the head of the private Windsor Candlelight Council, and every voice around her carried a different kind of hunger. The council was a closed family meeting, not a public ceremony, where senior royals discussed duties, roles, and the future shape of royal service after a tense anniversary service had exposed deep divisions. Camilla pushed for greater ceremonial authority, wanting a stronger place beside Charles at major royal moments. William questioned how family trust could survive if duty became a contest for position. The prince spoke carefully, but his concern was sharp. He feared the monarchy could lose its heart if everyone began fighting over rank. Sophie saw the room tightening before anyone else admitted it. Edward looked wounded by the harshness in the discussion, and the trusted confidant reached for his hand before his silence turned into anger. Charles tried to calm Camilla, but the king was caught between defending his wife and honoring his mother's quiet stare. Elizabeth watched him struggle, and the queen understood something painful. Duty had become a battlefield inside her own family, and the people closest to the crown were beginning to treat service like possession. Sophie spoke only once. She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse Camilla, challenge William, or embarrass Charles. The trusted confidant simply said that the crown survives through service, not possession, and those words settled over the table with more force than any argument. A documented account from the private review later preserved that sentence exactly, because Elizabeth asked for it to be written down before the night ended. The Queen wanted the words kept, not because they sounded grand, but because they revealed who understood the monarchy when pride had made everyone else forget it. Elizabeth returned to those words the next morning. She asked for her private writing box, dismissed the extra staff, and began drafting the hidden letter that would one day shake Charles to his core. The monarch did not tell him that Sophie had changed her mind that night. She did not warn Camilla that the trusted confidant had become the measure by which others would be judged. She did not even tell William that his concern had been heard. Elizabeth kept the truth sealed until the family was forced to face it. Once that forgotten night resurfaced, the letter stopped being a mystery and became a judgment no one could ignore. Camilla did not shout when she first heard Sophie's name. That was what made the silence worse. She stood across from Charles, her face controlled, her eyes fixed on the letter, as though the page itself had betrayed her. For years, she had survived judgment, scandal, and suspicion. But Elizabeth's final words cut differently, because they came from the one woman Camilla could never answer back. Camilla reached for the edge of the table, then stopped herself before her hand touched the page. The queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning king who shares public royal duties without holding ruling power herself, had fought too long to be seen as steady beside Charles. Now the letter made that steadiness feel questioned. The king stood opposite her with the hidden letter between them, and for once, he had no courtier, no advisor, no careful palace language to protect him. He only had Elizabeth's words, Sophie's name, and his wife's wounded stare. Camilla asked him one question, and it landed like a blade. Did Elizabeth mean to diminish her place beside him? Charles looked down before answering, and that small pause hurt her more than any sentence could have. The monarch wanted to defend Camilla. She had stood beside him through storms that would have broken many others. Yet every defense of the queen consort felt like resistance against his mother's final judgment, and the king knew it. He was trapped between the woman who shared his present and the monarch who had shaped his entire life. Camila picked up the letter at last, and her eyes found the underlined sentence that changed everything. Sophie was unshaken when others reached for importance. The words came from the documented account attached to Elizabeth's private review, and they carried the cold force of memory. The trusted confidant had not accused anyone, yet the sentence made Camila feel accused. Sophie had not asked for praise, yet the praise had become a mirror. The queen consort set the page down slowly, as if moving too fast would reveal how deeply it had cut. Charles whispered that Elizabeth had not written the letter to punish her, but Camila heard only the part he could not say. The late queen had chosen a different woman to represent the moral center of the family. The king saw the pain settle across his wife's face, and he knew the letter had opened a wound no apology could close. But while Camila saw insult, Anne saw something far more dangerous, a royal instruction that demanded action. Princess Anne did not react like the others. She did not gasp, argue, or search for comfort in the room. She read Elizabeth's hidden letter like a soldier reading final orders. Every sentence had weight, every pause had meaning. And when Anne set the page down, Charles understood that his sister had reached a conclusion before anyone else dared to speak it aloud. Anne placed her glasses on the table, and the sound felt sharper than any raised voice. The Princess Royal, meaning the monarch's daughter, who carries senior royal duties without standing above the line of succession, did not treat the letter as grief, memory, or family sentiment. She treated it as instruction. Charles watched her carefully, because the king knew his sister had never been moved by drama. Anne respected duty, and when duty spoke through Elizabeth's handwriting, she believed the family had no right to ignore it. Charles tried to remind her that the letter did not change legal succession. William remained the future king, and the prince's position was untouched by Elizabeth's words. Anne nodded once, but her answer was colder than comfort. Legal succession, she said, only decides who wears the crown. Family trust decides who protects its meaning. The hidden letter had created a symbolic framework, a private structure of responsibility that showed who Elizabeth trusted to guard memory, service, and continuity when the family itself became divided. Sophie sat nearby, overwhelmed by the force of Anne's support. The trusted confidant had feared the letter would make others resent her, but Anne made the burden feel official, almost unavoidable. She told Charles that Elizabeth chose Sophie because Sophie never confused service with rank. The line struck the king hard. He wanted to protect Camila from further pain, yet Anne forced him to separate personal loyalty from royal responsibility, and he knew the difference mattered. Anne then made the recommendation no one had expected so quickly. Sophie should receive a formal custodial role over selected family archives, charitable continuity, and private remembrance duties tied to Elizabeth's legacy. A custodial role meant she would not rule over anyone. She would guard important records, traditions, and responsibilities on behalf of the family. Charles looked down at the letter again, because Anne had turned grief into action, and action was much harder to soften. Sophie whispered that she never asked for this. Anne answered that Elizabeth had not chosen her because she asked, but because she had endured without reaching. Charles heard the warning inside those words. Camila would see the move as another wound. William would see it as a test of humility. The palace household would see it as a shift in power, even if no crown had moved. And by the next morning, the palace was no longer whispering about a letter. It was rearranging itself around Sophie's name. The first consequence came quietly. No trumpet, no balcony, no public announcement. Just a revised seating chart, a locked archive room, and a private memorandum that placed Sophie where Camila had expected to stand. In royal life, power rarely arrives with noise. Sometimes it enters through a changed protocol and leaves someone staring at an empty chair. Camila entered the planning room, expecting the old order to hold. The queen consort saw the briefing folder beside Charles's place, and then she saw Sophie's name printed where her own influence had once been assumed. A palace memorandum, meaning a formal internal note, used to guide staff decisions and royal arrangements, confirmed Sophie's new symbolic custodial role over Elizabeth's private remembrance materials and selected legacy duties. The role touched ceremonies, archive access, and the question of who would represent Elizabeth's continuity at private family moments. That mattered because memory inside a monarchy is never just memory. It becomes authority. Camila opened the folder, read the first page, and slowly closed it again. She did not challenge the secretary. She did not ask Charles for an explanation in front of the room. The queen consort simply stood still, let the silence grow heavy, and left before the meeting could begin. Charles watched her go with visible guilt, because the king had authorized the first practical step. He had not removed her title. He had not broken her place beside him. But he had allowed Elizabeth's letter to move Sophie into a space Camila believed belonged to her. William privately supported the change through a recorded conversation with Charles, and the prince's words carried calm conviction. He told the king that Sophie steadied the family when pride pulled others apart, and that Elizabeth's legacy needed someone who did not turn service into competition. William did not see Sophie as a threat. He saw the trusted confidant as a shield against deeper damage, especially while the family was already fragile. Sophie felt none of the triumph others imagined. She heard about the locked archive room, the revised folder, and the new duties, with a kind of dread that Edward could not ease. The trusted confidant knew every adjustment would be read as victory by some and betrayal by others. Charles knew it too. The king had taken Elizabeth's private judgment and turned it into palace action, and now everyone had to live with the result. Sophie would not stay silent for long. The trusted confidant needed to know whether this honor was truly a gift or a burden designed to break her. But the true turning point did not happen in a council room. It happened when Sophie and Charles finally spoke alone. When Sophie entered Charles's private room, she did not look triumphant. She looked frightened by the weight of a dead queen's trust. Charles had spent the day defending a letter that wounded his wife, unsettled his sister, and changed Sophie's future. But behind that closed door, there were no titles to hide behind, only two people facing Elizabeth's final act. Sophie stood before the desk and looked at the folded letter, as if touching it would make the burden permanent. The trusted confidant had accepted years of quiet duty, but this was different. A private royal room, in this context, meant a space where family matters were handled away from staff, ceremony, and public language. That mattered because no advisor could soften the truth now. Charles had placed Elizabeth's letter between them, and the king knew Sophie needed honesty, not protection. Sophie told him she did not want anyone to think she had taken something that belonged to another. Her voice stayed calm, but the pain beneath it was clear. She knew Camila would feel wounded. She knew Anne would defend the decision with steel. She knew William would understand the duty, but even understanding could not remove the loneliness. The trusted confidant had been praised by Elizabeth, yet that praise now threatened to isolate her from the very family she had spent years trying to steady. Charles listened without interrupting. Then he admitted, through a recorded private conversation later preserved in the family review, that Elizabeth had seen in Sophie what the family often failed to protect: steadiness without hunger. The king said those words slowly, because every part of them hurt. He had loved his mother. He had defended his wife. He had tried to hold the family together. But Elizabeth's final act had forced him to admit that loyalty was not always loud, and service was not always closest to the throne. Sophie asked whether refusing the role would protect the family from more pain. Charles shook his head. The monarch told her that refusing would make Elizabeth's last judgment meaningless, and the trusted confidant understood the cruelty of the choice. If she accepted, some would say she had risen above her place. If she refused, she would turn away from the queen who had trusted her most. Sophie finally agreed, but only on one condition. Her role had to be framed as service, not superiority. Charles accepted at once, and the king seemed steadier for the first time that day. Yet both of them knew the distinction would not stay private for long. And when the story reached the outside world, Britain did not hear a simple palace update. It heard Elizabeth speaking from beyond the grave. By sunrise, Sophie's name was everywhere. Not because she had demanded attention, but because Elizabeth's hidden letter had given Britain a new emotional image of royalty. The country was not watching a battle for a crown. It was watching a judgment about character. And suddenly, every old photograph, every quiet appearance, every overlooked gesture from Sophie seemed to carry a different meaning. Sophie woke to headlines she had never wanted. The trusted confidant had accepted Charles's condition of service, not superiority, but the outside world had already turned her into a symbol. One newspaper front page carried the words, "Elizabeth's last trust, Sophie named true heir of duty," printed beneath a solemn portrait of her. The phrase, "true heir of duty," did not mean a legal heir to the throne. It meant the person Elizabeth believed best carried the values of service, restraint, and loyalty. That mattered because Britain was not only measuring rank anymore, it was measuring character. Crowds gathered near Windsor Castle, and one woman holding flowers said, "The Queen knew who stayed steady." That single sentence moved faster than any official statement. Windsor Castle, one of the royal family's most important homes, became the place where public feeling turned personal, because people linked Elizabeth's memory to the walls she had known for so long. Outside Buckingham Palace, a broadcaster framed the story as, "Not a change of throne, but a change of moral inheritance." That line gave the palace exactly what it needed, a way to explain the shock without making it sound like rebellion. William watched the coverage in silence. The prince felt relief when he heard the broadcaster's words, because the public seemed to understand what some inside the family still resisted. Sophie had not replaced his future. The trusted confidant had been asked to guard a different kind of inheritance. William knew that distinction mattered, because without it, the letter could have become a scandal instead of a lesson. Camilla heard the same coverage differently. The queen consort sat apart, as commentators praised Sophie's quiet loyalty, and compared it with the conflicts that had followed other royals for years. Each compliment landed like another reminder that Elizabeth's final trust had not been placed in her hands. Camilla had survived public judgment before, but this felt colder. This came from memory, from history, from the Queen's own words. Charles understood that public emotion had chosen its symbol. The king also understood that applause for Sophie could become pain for Camilla if he did not define the meaning himself. Elizabeth's letter had escaped the room, but its final shape still rested with him. Public emotion had chosen its symbol, but only Charles could decide what Elizabeth's letter would finally mean inside the crown. In the end, Charles did not treat the letter as a weapon. He treated it as a mirror. Elizabeth had not written to humiliate Camilla, bypass William, or crown Sophie in law. She had written to remind her family what royalty becomes when rank loses humility. And when Charles finally spoke, his voice carried grief, surrender, and the painful peace of a son accepting his mother's truth. Charles gathered the family and placed Elizabeth's letter on the table, not as evidence against anyone, but as inheritance for everyone. The king looked at Sophie first, then Camilla, then William, because each of them had carried a different wound from the same page. Constitutional succession, meaning the legal order that decides who inherits the throne, remained untouched. William would still be the future king. The prince's place was not weakened. Sophie's role was different. The trusted confidant would become the symbolic guardian of Elizabeth's private legacy, meaning she would protect the memory, values, and selected family duties the queen believed mattered most. Charles told Sophie that her role was not power over the family. It was responsibility for the memory that held the family together. The trusted confidant lowered her head, and for the first time, her fear seemed to soften into acceptance. She had not asked to stand at the center of this storm, but she understood now that Elizabeth had not chosen her for glory. The queen had chosen her because service had shaped her when ambition had tested others. Camilla absorbed the verdict with visible pain, but she did not resist it in public. The queen consort understood that Elizabeth's words could not be undone, and fighting them would only make the wound deeper. Charles saw that pain, and the king did not pretend it was small. Yet he also knew the monarchy could not survive by hiding from the truth his mother had left behind. William accepted the decision because it strengthened the crown without threatening the throne. The prince understood that Sophie's duty protected the moral center of the family, while his future protected its constitutional path. That difference saved the moment from becoming a war. Sophie accepted with humility. The trusted confidant chose duty over fear, service over personal comfort, and loyalty over the loneliness that Elizabeth's trust had placed upon her. The final verdict was clear. Elizabeth's hidden letter did not change who would wear the crown. It changed what the crown would be expected to mean. And with that, the monarchy did not collapse under Elizabeth's final words. It was forced to remember why those words still mattered. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.